I answered every question myself. That was the part I kept replaying afterward, not because I forgot anything. Because even after answering clearly, confidently, perfectly, my son still leaned toward the doctor and quietly said, "She gets confused sometimes." The sentence hollowed me instantly. The appointment had started normally enough. Rain tapped softly against the clinic windows while patients flipped through old magazines in the waiting room. Normal medical office. Normal Tuesday morning. At least that was what I believed. Michael insisted on driving me because my appointment required eye dilation afterward. Reasonable, thoughtful. That was what made everything afterward feel so humiliating. The nurse called my name and led us into a small examination room smelling faintly of disinfectant and coffee. The doctor smiled warmly while scrolling through charts. Routine questions followed. Any headaches lately? No. Still taking the same medications? Yes. Any dizziness or balance issues? No. I answered everything immediately. Clearly, the doctor nodded while typing notes. Normal appointment. Then he asked casually, "Any memory concerns recently?" Before I could even open my mouth, Michael leaned forward slightly beside me. "She gets confused sometimes." The room seemed to narrow instantly around those 4 words. I turned slowly toward my son, confused sometimes, not grieving, not distracted, not overwhelmed, confused. Clinical language quietly swallowing ordinary humanity again. The doctor's expression changed immediately. Subtly, but enough. That was what hurt most. Not dramatic alarm, adjustment. His tone softened slightly afterward. His pace slowed. His eyes lingered on me differently, all because of one sentence. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Everything I said afterward would now be filtered through suspicion. That was the trap. I stared toward Michael while cold spread painfully through my chest. "I'm sitting right here." The room went completely still. Michael blinked immediately, too quickly, too defensively. "I know." "No, interesting word, not sorry, not I shouldn't have interrupted." "No," the doctor cleared his throat awkwardly, then gently asked me, "Have you noticed yourself forgetting things more lately?" Gently, always gently. The tone people use once someone else quietly introduces doubt into the room. I suddenly felt exhausted in a way I could barely describe. Not physically, existentially. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra casually asking, "Still getting overwhelmed in crowded places?" At the time, I thought she worried emotionally. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, they had probably already been discussing confusion privately long before this appointment. Every memory rearranged itself differently again. Not concern. Narrative building, then another horrifying realization surfaced. Michael did not simply answer for me, he reframed me. That was the humiliation. I sat quietly while the doctor continued speaking carefully now. Too carefully. "Any trouble keeping track of appointments?" There it was, the shift, not routine anymore. Assessment. All because my son quietly inserted doubt into the room. I answered firmly. "No." The doctor nodded slowly, but something had already changed. I could feel it. Every answer now sounded provisional somehow. Evaluated. Cross-checked internally against Michael's earlier comment. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard forgetting names constantly after 60. Nobody quietly briefed doctors beforehand. Nobody inserted concern into conversations he was already handling perfectly himself. Because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially human, elderly forgetfulness becomes medically loaded. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then the doctor asked, "Still managing finances okay?" The question hit like ice water. Managing finances. Not because of anything I said, because Michael had opened the door. I stared directly at the doctor. "Yes," firmly this time. Then I turned slowly toward my son, "And I drove myself here perfectly fine before your father died too." The room stayed completely still. Because there it was, perfect truth, not transportation help, authority transfer, little by little, question by question. Fear quietly repositioning my children as interpreters of my reality, instead of simply participants inside it. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For months now, my family probably discussed me with professionals before discussing things honestly with me. The thought hollowed me completely. Then another memory surfaced. Last month, Michael asking oddly specific questions about missed bills. At the time, I thought he worried after Richard handled finances for years. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not help evidence gathering. Then the doctor smiled softly toward me. Well, you seem very sharp today. Sharp today, today. The word settled heavily through the room, not sharp. Not perfectly capable. Sharp today. Conditional competence. I suddenly realized something devastating. Even when older adults perform perfectly, fear still leaves room for future doubt afterward. That was the real tragedy. Not mistakes. Fragility assigned by other people's fear. Then Michael quietly added something that nearly broke me completely. She's better some days than others. The world seemed to narrow instantly around those words. Better some days, not grieving differently, not tired occasionally, fluctuating. I stared toward my son while something inside me quietly cracked open, because suddenly I understood something devastating. I was no longer simply mom inside my family's minds. I had quietly become a condition they monitored together. After Michael said that the appointment never felt normal again, that was the damage, not one sentence, repositioning. The moment my son described me as someone who gets confused sometimes, the room quietly stopped belonging fully to me. I could feel it immediately. The doctor's tone softened further. Questions slowed down, explanations became simpler, not dramatically, subtly, that somehow hurt more. I sat there answering every question clearly while simultaneously feeling myself becoming less authoritative inside the room anyway. That was the humiliation. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 months earlier, Sandra saying casually, "You seem really sharp today." At the time I smiled warmly. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, sharp today implied uncertainty tomorrow. Every compliment now rearranged itself differently again, not reassurance, comparison. Then the doctor asked, "Any trouble following conversations lately?" There it was again. Not because of anything I had done, because Michael quietly shifted the narrative before I could speak for myself. I answered firmly, "No." The doctor nodded politely. Yet I could still feel the evaluation continuing underneath his expression. Cross-checking, watching, interpreting. Fear spreads quickly once introduced into professional spaces. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For months, I whispered internally, my family may have already been discussing me this way with other people. The thought made me physically ill. Doctors, pharmacists, neighbors perhaps. How many rooms had I already entered carrying invisible narratives I never consented to? Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last month, the pharmacist handing medication explanations to Michael instead of me. At the time, I assumed distraction. Now everything rearranged itself differently again, not distraction. Redirection. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. Once someone labels an older adult as confused sometimes, other people quietly start looking for confirmation automatically. That was the trap. Every hesitation becomes meaningful. Every pause becomes evidence. Every emotional reaction quietly reinforces doubt. I suddenly understood why older adults sometimes stop fighting these narratives entirely. Because resistance itself starts sounding suspicious eventually. Then the doctor smiled gently and said, "Well, it's good your son keeps such a close eye on things." Close eye, interesting phrase, not supportive relationship, not loving family, observation. I stared down at my folded hands while cold spread slowly through my chest. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting entire conversations, sometimes after 65. Nobody briefed doctors about him beforehand. Nobody inserted quiet caveats into appointments, because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially ordinary. Elderly forgetfulness becomes medically predictive. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Michael probably believed he was helping. That somehow made everything worse. Because suddenly, I realized my humiliation had not come from cruelty. It came from fear disguised as responsibility. Then the doctor asked another question carefully. Have you ever gotten disoriented while driving? Before I could answer, Michael quietly said, just once during Christmas shopping. Once. One missed turn during heavy holiday traffic now transformed into clinical evidence. I turned sharply toward him. I missed one exit in the rain. Michael nodded quickly. I know. No again. Always no, never sorry. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm, too managed. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Sandra calling after that shopping trip asking, did you feel confused in traffic? At the time I thought she worried about stress. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. The event had already entered the family narrative system. Everything rearranged itself differently again. Not concern, documentation. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. For months now, ordinary human mistakes had quietly stopped remaining ordinary inside my family's minds. Every lapse carried future implications. Every emotional moment became potential warning signs. Fear had quietly contaminated proportion itself. Then the doctor smiled softly toward Michael. Good thing you noticed. Noticed. The word settled heavily through the room, because there it was. Perfect clarity. Not, good thing she's okay. Not, holiday traffic is stressful. Good thing you noticed. Observation rewarded. Vigilance validated. Fear feeds beautifully on professional confirmation. I suddenly felt exhausted beyond words. Not because I doubted myself, because I realized other people now quietly might. Then another memory surfaced. The night Richard died, Michael whispering, I should have noticed sooner that something was wrong. God help me. Maybe everything afterward started there, not with memory lapses, not with confusion. Guilt, one devastating loss quietly teaching my son that vigilance might prevent future tragedy. That did not erase the humiliation. But finally, it explained why he sounded so frightened all the time. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The doctor no longer saw me independently now. He saw me through Michael's fear. That was the deepest wound underneath everything. Interpretive ownership. My son had quietly become narrator instead of simply companion. Then the appointment ended. The doctor shook my hand warmly, yet his final sentence nearly broke me completely. Keep monitoring things closely. Monitoring, not living, not grieving, not aging normally, monitoring. The word echoed painfully through my chest, while rain battered softly against the clinic windows outside. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For months now, my family had not simply been loving me through grief. They had been watching me through it, and suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary human imperfection into medical concern. Once the people who love you become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. The drive home felt unbearably quiet. Rain blurred softly across the windshield while Michael gripped the steering wheel too tightly beside me. Normal road, normal afternoon. Yet somehow everything between us had shifted permanently inside that doctor's office. That was the damage, not concern itself. Translation. My son had translated ordinary humanity into clinical language in front of someone else. Confused, better some days, needs watching, tiny phrases. Yet somehow powerful enough to quietly change how the world responded to me afterward. I stared silently out the passenger window while storefronts blurred past through the rain. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra saying, "You seemed more like yourself yesterday." At the time, I smiled weakly. Now my stomach tightened painfully. More like yourself. Conditional identity. Every memory rearranged itself differently again, not reassurance. Comparison. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For months, I whispered internally, My family has already been speaking about me as fluctuating instead of whole. The thought hollowed me completely. Michael finally spoke softly. You're angry, angry, interesting word. Not humiliated, not hurt. Angry, emotion quietly reframed as overreaction again. I stared toward him slowly. You told a doctor I get confused. Michael tightened his grip on the steering wheel. You do sometimes. There it was, perfect certainty. Not I worry, not I'm scared, fact. The sentence landed painfully through my chest, because suddenly I realized something devastating. My son no longer experienced fear as fear, he experienced it as truth. That was the trap. Fear repeated often enough eventually stops feeling emotional. It starts feeling objective. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. The first Christmas after Richard died when I forgot where I placed presents. At the time, everyone laughed gently. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. Someone probably remembered it later as evidence. Everything rearranged itself differently again. Not grief, confusion. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. How many ordinary human moments had quietly changed categories inside my children's minds without me knowing. The thought made me physically ill. Then Michael whispered softly, We're trying to catch things early. Early again, always early. Future decline constantly invading present humanity. I looked out through the rain-darkened windshield while exhaustion spread heavily through my chest. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting directions constantly after 60. Nobody briefed doctors about him. Nobody quietly inserted concern into conversations he was already handling himself. Because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially human. Elderly forgetfulness becomes medically loaded. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Michael truly believed vigilance was love now. That was what made everything so tragic. Not cruelty, distorted devotion. Fear had quietly transformed observation into moral responsibility. Then I quietly asked, Do you know what hurt most? Michael glanced toward me briefly. What? You answered for me before I even spoke. Perfect silence filled the car afterward. Because there it was, the deepest wound underneath everything. Not concern, replacement, little by little, question by question. Fear quietly repositioning my children as interpreters of my reality instead of witnesses to it. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last month, the pharmacist explaining side effects directly to Michael instead of me. At the time, I assumed convenience. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not convenience. Authority transfer. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. Once older adults get quietly labeled as cognitively questionable, other people stop fully interacting with them directly. That was the real humiliation. Not forgetting things, becoming narratively fragile in other people's eyes. Then Michael whispered softly, After Dad died, every little thing scared us. There it was finally, perfect honesty, not control, not manipulation, trauma. One devastating loss quietly teaching my children to emotionally scan every ordinary imperfection afterward, for signs another devastating loss might already be beginning. That did not erase the humiliation, but finally, it explained why fear entered every room before I did. Rain hammered softly across the windshield, while traffic lights reflected red against wet pavement outside. Then another realization surfaced slowly. The doctor appointment was never really about medical concerns. It was about my son trying desperately to prevent surprise. Every observation, every cautious comment, every quiet warning to professionals. All attempts to control uncertainty after grief shattered the family's sense of safety. That was the tragedy. Fear feeds beautifully on vigilance, because vigilance creates the illusion of preparedness. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror before appointments, lately silently rehearsing medications and dates. Not because I forgot them, because I was terrified of hesitation. God help me. I had already started performing competence instead of simply existing naturally. That was the real tragedy underneath everything. Not aging, self-surveillance. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke me. I don't know how to stop being afraid. The sentence settled heavily through the quiet car. Because finally he sounded like my son again instead of my observer. Not objective, not clinical, terrified, I looked slowly toward him. Rain streaked across the windows, while his hands trembled slightly against the steering wheel. Then another realization surfaced painfully. My children were not trying to erase my humanity. They were trying to emotionally protect themselves from losing me unexpectedly. And somewhere inside that desperate fear, they slowly stopped letting me remain fully human. Then I quietly admitted something devastating for the first time. Now every time I forget something, my voice cracked slightly. I wonder who else you've already warned about me. Michael's face crumpled instantly, because finally he understood the actual damage underneath everything. Not concern, narrative contamination. Fear had quietly followed me into rooms before I arrived in them, and suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly convince the people who love you that they should start explaining you to the world before you even have the chance to speak for yourself. After the appointment, I started noticing the shifts everywhere. That was what terrified me most. Not one doctor, not one conversation, a pattern. Once someone quietly introduces doubt about an older adult, the world starts responding differently almost immediately. The pharmacist spoke slower. The receptionist looked toward Michael before answering certain questions. Even the dental assistant smiled at me too gently during my cleaning the following week. Too gently. That hurt more than open disrespect ever could. I sat in the dentist's chair staring at fluorescent lights while the hygienist asked, still remembering to floss regularly, remembering. Interesting word. Not, are you flossing regularly? Remembering. Tiny shifts in language quietly revealing invisible narratives underneath them. My stomach tightened painfully. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 months earlier, the bank teller asking Michael, would you like to review this with her? At the time, I assumed politeness. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not politeness. Transferred authority. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For months, I whispered internally, my family may have already been preparing other people to see me differently. The thought hollowed me completely. Rain tapped softly against the dentist office windows while machines hummed quietly nearby. Always rain lately. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting passwords constantly after 65. Nobody quietly briefed professionals about him. Nobody inserted warnings before appointments. Because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially ordinary. Elderly forgetfulness becomes institutionally loaded. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. After the cleaning ended, the receptionist handed paperwork directly to Michael. Not me. Michael corrected her immediately. She can take it. Can, interesting word, not of course she can. Can, even correction now carried traces of doubt underneath it. The receptionist apologized awkwardly. Yet something had already shifted emotionally anyway. That was the damage. Once older adults become narratively fragile in other people's minds, even ordinary interactions start bending around that fragility automatically. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. Michael noticed it too. I could see shame flicker across his face each time someone redirected attention toward him instead of me. That somehow made everything sadder. Not because he wanted control. Because his fear had escaped into the world and started changing how people treated me before he even fully realized it. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last month, Sandra saying quietly, we should probably let the doctor know what's been happening. At the time I thought she meant grief. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. They had already started building external narratives. Everything rearranged itself differently again. Not support. Case presentation. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. My children no longer simply experienced me privately. They had started managing my image publicly too. That was the deepest wound underneath everything. Interpretive ownership. Then Michael drove me home silently through steady rain. Neither of us spoke much. Not because there was nothing to say, because both of us finally understood the same devastating thing. Fear had already escaped containment. It now lived inside systems, appointments, professional interactions, not just family conversations anymore. Then another memory surfaced. The night Richard died, Michael whispering, "I should have noticed sooner. God help me." Maybe that sentence truly poisoned everything afterward, not because my son stopped loving me. Because grief convinced him vigilance equals protection. And once vigilance becomes moral responsibility, observation starts feeling virtuous. That was the tragedy. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The doctor probably genuinely believed he was helping too. Everyone did. That somehow made the humiliation worse. No villains, no cruelty. Just terrified people quietly reinforcing one another's fear, until ordinary humanity started sounding clinically suspicious. Then I quietly asked Michael, "Do you know what frightens me now?" He glanced toward me briefly while stopping at a red light. "What? That one day I'll forget something normal." My voice cracked slightly. "And nobody will know whether to treat me like a grieving person or a failing one." Perfect silence filled the car afterward, because there it was, the deepest tragedy underneath everything. Context collapse, grief, stress, fatigue, aging, all quietly collapsing into the same frightening interpretation once fear enters the room first. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Standing before medical appointments, lately silently rehearsing medications, addresses, and dates. Not because I forgot them, because I was terrified of hesitation changing how people looked at me. God help me, I had already started performing cognitive safety for the world. That was the real tragedy underneath everything. Not aging, conditional humanity. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke my heart. "I never wanted people to stop seeing you normally." The sentence settled heavily through the rain-filled silence. Because finally he understood the actual damage underneath everything. Not concern, perception contamination. Fear had quietly followed me into rooms before I entered them. Then another realization surfaced slowly. And maybe that was why the appointment hurt so deeply, not because my son worried. Because he quietly introduced uncertainty about my mind into a room where I had already been speaking perfectly for myself. That was the humiliation, not forgetting, being preemptively doubted. I stared through the rain-darkened windshield, while traffic lights glowed softly ahead. Then quietly whispered, "I miss walking into rooms without someone already deciding how much confidence to place in my answers." Michael cried silently beside me then. Because finally he understood the deepest wound underneath everything. Not the questions, not the concern, the quiet erosion of unquestioned personhood. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly teach the people who love you to start interpreting you for the world before you even get the chance to speak for yourself. A few weeks later, I almost canceled another appointment because of fear. That realization frightened me more than anything else, not because I feared doctors. Because suddenly I feared entering rooms where other people might already quietly doubt me before I opened my mouth. That was the damage, not concern itself. Preemptive fragility. I stood in the bathroom one rainy Thursday morning staring at my reflection while rehearsing answers silently in my head. Address, medications, appointment time, not because I forgot them. Because I was terrified of hesitation. God help me. I had started preparing for ordinary conversations like legal testimony. That was the real tragedy. Fear repeated long enough eventually teaches older adults to perform competence, constantly, instead of simply existing naturally. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard forgetting entire phone numbers after 60. Everyone laughed affectionately. Nobody quietly warned receptionists about him beforehand. Nobody softened their tone around him. Because middle-aged forgetfulness remains socially human, elderly forgetfulness becomes institutionally loaded. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed while rain tapped softly against the windows again. Always rain lately. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For months, I whispered internally, I've been entering rooms already carrying other people's fear. The sentence hollowed me completely. Then Sandra called. Her voice sounded smaller lately. Careful, not clinically careful, emotionally careful, the difference mattered. You still going to your appointment? There it was again. Simple question. Yet suddenly my stomach tightened automatically. Not because Sandra sounded manipulative, because fear had quietly retrained my nervous system. Every question now carried invisible evaluation underneath it. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last month, the pharmacist glancing toward Michael before answering medication questions. At the time, I felt confused. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not confusion, transferred authority. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. My children had not only changed how they saw me, they changed how the world interacted with me too. That was the deepest humiliation underneath everything. Sandra spoke softly through the phone. You don't have to go alone. Alone, interesting word, not capable, not independent, alone. Even kindness now carried traces of fragility underneath it. I closed my eyes briefly. I can drive myself. Perfect silence answered me, not argumentative silence, fearful silence. That somehow hurt more, because suddenly I realized my children no longer heard independence neutrally. They heard risk. Then another memory surfaced. The missed exit during Christmas shopping. One wrong turn in heavy rain quietly transformed into family evidence of cognitive concern afterward. God help me. Ordinary human mistakes no longer remained ordinary inside my family's minds. That was the tragedy. Then Sandra whispered softly, We're not trying to take control. There it was finally, perfect honesty, not because I accused her directly. Because somewhere deep down, she already understood what this all resembled emotionally. Monitoring, narrating, explaining me to others. Little by little, fear quietly repositioning my children between me and the world. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. And worse, part of me had already started accepting it emotionally. That frightened me most of all. I remembered handing Michael paperwork automatically lately without thinking. Letting Sandra answer small questions in stores because correcting her felt exhausting. Not because I could not speak for myself. Because resisting invisible doubt all the time slowly wears older adults down. That was the trap. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches people to surrender authority simply to avoid emotional exhaustion. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard interrupting doctors constantly after 65 because he hated anyone speaking for him. Everyone laughed about how stubborn he was. Nobody quietly interpreted it as cognitive defensiveness. Because middle-aged insistence remains personality, elderly insistence becomes concerning. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Rain moved softly across the bedroom windows, while silence settled heavily through the phone line. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke my heart. After Dad died, every little thing started feeling dangerous. There it was again, the real origin underneath everything, not confusion, not aging, trauma. One devastating loss quietly teaching my children that ordinary life could collapse without warning. After that, every forgotten detail carried emotional weight. Every hesitation became loaded. Every ordinary human lapse quietly transformed into anticipated catastrophe. That did not erase the humiliation. But finally, it explained why fear entered every room before I did. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The appointments were never really the problem. The problem was that my children quietly stopped trusting my humanity to remain stable without monitoring. That was everything. I looked toward my reflection again in the bedroom mirror. Tired eyes. Gray hair, rain-darkened room behind me. Still me. Yet somehow fear had quietly transformed me into possibility instead of person inside other people's minds. Then I quietly admitted something devastating for the first time. Sometimes now, my voice cracked slightly. I feel like I have to prove I'm still myself every time I leave the house. Sandra cried softly on the other end of the line, because finally she understood the actual damage underneath everything. Not the doctor, not the questions, the quiet erosion of unquestioned identity, and suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly convince the people who love you that your competence must constantly be confirmed. Once they become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. The next appointment I went alone, not angrily, quietly. That distinction mattered. I drove through steady rain with the radio low and Richard's old umbrella sliding across the passenger seat beside me whenever I turned corners. Normal drive. Normal afternoon. Yet my hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel anyway, not because I feared forgetting something. Because suddenly, I feared entering another room already shaped by someone else's concern before I arrived. That was the damage. Fear had quietly followed me into professional spaces and changed how I moved through them. When I reached the clinic, the receptionist smiled politely. No softened voice. No cautious glances toward a companion, just normal. The simplicity of that nearly made me cry. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. The last appointment. Michael quietly saying, "She gets confused sometimes." Tiny sentence, enormous consequence. God help me, I still felt its echo every time someone asked me a question now. I checked in calmly and sat beside the rain-streaked waiting room window. Magazine pages turned softly nearby. Coffee machine humming in the hallway. Phones ringing occasionally. Ordinary sounds. And for the first time in months, nobody looked at me like fragile information being transferred between caregivers. That realization hollowed me and healed me at the same time. Then the doctor entered. Different doctor this time, routine follow-up. He smiled warmly. "How have you been?" Simple question, not coded, not evaluative, just human. I answered naturally before panic could interrupt me. "Lonely sometimes, tired lately, better than last winter." Better than last winter, interesting phrase. For the first time in months, the word better actually belonged to emotion instead of cognitive assessment. The doctor nodded kindly. "That makes sense after losing your husband." Makes sense. Not concerning, not suspicious. Human. I nearly cried right there in the chair, because suddenly I realized how starving I had become for ordinary interpretation. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Sandra asking, "Still getting emotional late at night?" At the time I thought she worried compassionately. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not grief support. Monitoring. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. I had spent months defending ordinary humanity against fear-based interpretation. That exhaustion sat deep in my bones now. The doctor continued calmly. "Sleeping okay?" Simple question. No hidden testing rhythm. No visible relief waiting behind correct answers. Just conversation. I answered honestly. "Some nights are harder." The doctor nodded gently. "That's normal, normal." The word hit me like sunlight after winter. Not alarming, not evidence. Normal. I suddenly realized how long it had been since anyone simply allowed my grief and forgetfulness to exist without attaching catastrophic possibility to them. That was the deepest wound underneath everything. Not observation, interpretation. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting where he parked constantly after 65. Everyone laughed affectionately. Nobody quietly reclassified him as fragile afterward, because middle-aged imperfection remains socially human. Elderly imperfection becomes predictive. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. The appointment ended simply. No warnings, no monitoring discussions, no careful caveats. The doctor smiled warmly while standing. "Take care of yourself." Yourself, not "have someone help monitor you," yourself. The ordinary dignity of that nearly broke me. Outside, rain moved softly across the parking lot while I stood beside my car for several long seconds breathing cold air. Then another realization surfaced slowly. My children never actually meant to erase my humanity. They were trying desperately to protect themselves from surprise. That was the tragedy. Fear after loss quietly convinced them that vigilance equals love. And somewhere inside that fear, they slowly stopped letting ordinary humanity remain ordinary. Every forgotten detail became loaded. Every emotional moment became suspicious. Every hesitation quietly transformed into possible evidence, not because they stopped loving me, because they became terrified of missing signs. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. The night Richard died, Michael whispering, "I should have known something was wrong." God help me, maybe everything afterward truly began there. One devastating loss quietly poisoning the family's relationship with uncertainty itself. Then, I drove home slowly through rain-darkened streets, while jazz played softly through the speakers. No tests, no careful observations, no one interpreting me before I spoke. Just me, human, grieving, aging, still whole. And suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people notice when you struggle. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary humanity into ongoing evidence. Once the people who love you become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you.